The summer sun hovered low over the hills of eastern Kansas, casting long amber shadows across the Odell family homestead. It should have been a comforting sight, the way the wheat fields bent in rhythm with the wind, how the porch swing creaked under the weight of familiar silence, but for Martha Jane Odell, it was the prelude to exile. She stood at the edge of the porch in her best cotton dress, though it clung to her in the wrong places, unforgiving of every curve. Her arms ached from tugging the corset tighter than usual, a hopeless attempt to resemble what her mother once called a God-fearing figure. It was always like this, trying to shrink herself into silence, into neatness, into acceptability. The whispers had begun when she was 12, and her hips arrived early. By 15, even church ladies commented with false smiles about her growing presence. By 20, suitors stopped calling. By 25, her name was a silent prayer her mother murmured in embarrassment. At 30, Martha Jane had learned to walk without taking up space, to laugh behind closed doors, to speak with measured restraint, yet nothing had ever been enough. The truth, as it had always echoed through slamming doors and prayerful sighs, was that Martha Jane was too much, too tall, too wide, too loud when she laughed, too serious when she sang, and worst of all, too unmarried at 30. Not just a disappointment, but a shame. She had tried to atone through obedience, through invisibility, through earnestness, but in a house of shallow piety and image. Her very being was an offense. Her mother, Rebecca Odell, emerged from the house with her chin held high and eyes sharpened by decades of disappointment. "Mind your posture," she hissed as she passed, not sparing her daughter a glance. "You look like a sack of meal." Martha Jane drew her shoulders back, though every fiber in her wanted to fold in on herself. Her father, Reverend Caleb Odell, paced near the barn, Bible in one hand, hat in the other. His boots beat a rhythm of anxiety into the dirt. He hadn't spoken a word to her all morning, not since the letter had arrived from the territorial office bearing the seal of the federal land commissioner. There had been trouble, whispers in town, then accusations. The Reverend's claim to a parcel of riverfront land was being contested by a Lakota tribe. The courts were undecided, but his allies had waned. And when all legal channels had failed, another kind of deal had been made, one that involved silence, one that involved Martha Jane. "I did what I had to," her father had told Rebecca the night before, his voice muffled behind the parlor doors. "They need something in return, something symbolic, a show of peace. And you offered her." Her mother's voice had broken, not from grief, but from the sharp edge of humiliation. "She's never fit here. You know that. She's always been difficult, unmarriageable. This will buy us time, respect, and she'll have a place, of sorts." Now, as the wagon rumbled into the yard, pulled by two sway-backed horses and driven by a man in a brown coat, too clean for this side of the prairie, Martha Jane felt the ground tilt. The man dismounted, tipping his hat toward Caleb. "You the Reverend?" he asked. "I am." "You have the girl." The words hit Martha Jane like a slap. The girl, as if her name, her being, her years of silence and effort and shame were nothing but a title for barter, something less than human, something tradable. She felt her face flush, not with embarrassment, but with a heat that rose from somewhere far deeper, humiliation, laced with the ache of betrayal. Her own father had arranged this. Her flesh and blood had reduced her to a transaction, a token for a land dispute. The small, fragile scaffolding of dignity she had tried to hold on to all her life splintered right then. She wanted to scream, to run, to vanish, but her feet remained rooted to the porch, as if even her body had accepted she no longer belonged to herself. "She's not a girl," Caleb said, the corners of his mouth twitching and deceased, "but she's ready. The man's eyes fell on Martha Jane. His gaze slid over her, as if measuring weight, cost, and inconvenience. This her? She'll do. The man muttered. Something inside Martha Jane snapped. Do, she echoed, her voice brittle. Like I'm a mule or a sack of grain. Caleb's glare silenced her. Enough. Martha. It was the last time he would say her name. They left before noon. She wasn't allowed to bring much. A Bible, a hairbrush, a bag with a single change of clothes. Her mother handed it to her with arms stiff as fence posts. You keep your head down, she said. You bring no further shame to this family. There was no hug, no farewell, just the clatter of wheels on dry earth and the steady diminishing of everything she had ever known. The wagon took her west through weeks of dust and silence. The trader spoke little. When he did, it was curt. He called her the offering once. She stopped asking questions after that. When they finally reached the out east, Fort Shiloh, the sun was a cruel disk above a bone-colored sky. The fort wasn't much more than a series of sun-bleached buildings clustered against the edge of Lakota territory. A few soldiers stood moping by the stables, watching as she dismounted with all the grace her aching legs could offer. Inside the commander's office, papers were seen. The trader took his payment, and Martha Jane was summoned outside. He was already there, leaning against the post, like a man carved from the stone behind him. But he wasn't just still. He was watchful. His eyes met hers with a calm that felt unsettling, as though he already knew what she feared, what she hated about herself. There was no pity in his gaze, nor was there cruelty. Just a quiet, unreadable weight, like someone who had seen far more than his share of suffering. Martha Jane's first thought wasn't of his build or skin or strange name. It was that he looked like no man she'd ever known. And yet, he didn't flinch at the sight of her. He didn't look away in shame or distaste. That absence of recoil was more shocking than scorn would have been. She felt exposed beneath his gaze, but not humiliated, only uncomfortably visible. For the first time in days, maybe years, she wasn't invisible, and that frightened her even more. His features were sharp, but not unkind cheekbones cut like ridgelines, a mouth that didn't smile, but held no mockery. His eyes, dark as the riverbed after a flood, didn't wander over her body with judgment like so many others had. Instead, they met her eyes directly, steady, quiet, as if measuring something beyond her flesh, something she wasn't sure she possessed. Was he disappointed? Amos, did he think she was gross? The questions raced in her chest like startled birds. She braced herself for a flinch, a sneer, a wordless turn away. But it never came. He simply stood there, patient, silent, and for one wild, dangerous second, Martha Jane felt the ghost of something she hadn't allowed herself in years, a flicker of hope. This is James Black Elk, one of the officers said. He's agreed to accept the arrangement. Arrangement. The word made her stomach clench. James stepped forward. His voice was calming to quit. You come with me. If you choose not to, you may stay with the soldiers. She stared at him. I don't get to go home. You were never meant to, he said. And that was the moment she realized this wasn't a journey. It was a wavering. She followed him into the unknown, dust curling around her boots like fingers from a world that would not let her go. James Black Elk was not a man of words. For the first 3 days on the trail, he barely spoke, communicating only through sparse gestures or the occasional nod. Sometimes, he simply walked ahead, letting the wind and dust speak in his stead. And though Martha Jane had long grown used to the silence of others, his quietude scraped at her like a blunt knife, not because it was cruel, but because it was so carefully indifferent. So light it cut deep. She followed him across a land scorched into rust, where the earth cracked like the hide of some great beast long dead. And the horizon shimmered, as if too tired to hold itself still. Trees were few, the sky relentless. By day, the heat pressed down like a hammer. By night, the cold crept into her joints like regret. James didn't speak, but he allowed her to rest when she staggered. He gave her water before he drank. He never offered explanation, nor comfort. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. No kindness, but no cruelty. Just silence. In that silence, Martha Jane felt less like a companion and more like a shadow trailing a man made of stone. She did not know what he thought of her, but when their eyes did meet, something flinched in her chest, not desire, but a dread of being seen too clearly. On the fourth night, she broke. "Am I slowing you down?" she asked, her voice hoarse from wind and doubt. James didn't answer right away. He fed the campfire, watching the flame steady itself, then said without turning, "No." One word. Clean, clipped, without inflection. But somehow, it rattled her more than any scolding ever had. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or dismissed. By the fifth day, her feet blistered inside boots not meant for this world. Her palms had calloused from gripping the saddle horn when riding the stocky pony James tethered for her use in the afternoons. Each evening, her body ached from head to heel. Her clothes clung with sweat and musty. Pride had long since been left behind, discarded somewhere between exhaustion and need, and yet something strange began to stir in her. For the first time in her life, she did not think of her body as a burden, but as a vessel she had to endure, a tool she had to learn. Her size, which once marked her as a shameful, now anchored her against the unrelenting wind. Here, in this wilderness, no one came to help. If she did not rise, she would remain on the ground. If she did not walk, she would be left behind. That night, as they made camp beneath a crumbling cliff, the wind howled through the rocks like a warning from the bones of the earth. Martha Jane could bear the silence no longer. "Why did you take me?" she asked, bitterness fraying the edge of her voice. James was washing a blade in the creek, his hands sure and deliberate, as if carving peace from the steel. He looked up. For a long time, he simply stared. "Because someone had to," he said at last. "And I knew they would choose the one no one else would." The words struck something raw and unguarded in her. She didn't know if it was insult or insight. She wanted to ask more, to peel back what lay beneath his quiet. But he turned back to the blade. Minutes passed. Then his voice came again, low and steady. "They think you're ash. What's left after the fire?" She closed her fists in her lap, the shame surging like a second heartbeat. "And you?" she asked, barely a whisper. "Do you think that too?" The flames cracked. The wind shifted. "Then ash still holds heat," he said. "People just forget how to touch it." She sat still, breath caught like a thorn in her throat. The next morning, James handed her a small piece of wood, carved with faint lines and symbols she didn't recognize. "This branch," he said, "was struck by lightning, but it didn't burn all the way. I carved it, made it into a knife handle. You keep it." She took it in trembling hands, not because of the gift, but the way he offered it, without pity, without doubt, as if, for the first time, he saw her as someone who could hold something and not let it break. By the time they reached the village, nestled among sun-bleached hills and cottonwood trees, Martha Jane's body had grown numb to discomfort, but her heart had not. Her dress hung in dusty creases, her boots cracked at the seams, and the wind had carved her cheeks with the same harshness it gave the earth. Yet it was not the landscape that unnerved her, it was the eyes. They appeared slowly, From under door flaps, behind woven curtains, around corners where baskets were being mended and herbs were hung to dry. Children stopped their play to stare, then scurried like field mice into shadows. Women paused mid-task, glancing without smiling, their expressions unreadable. Men gave her one look and turned back to their work. No one approached. No one welcomed. But no one rejected her either. Martha Jane stood near James as he spoke to the elders in Lakota, his voice low and even, occasionally nodding in her direction. She understood none of it, save the weight of every syllable. She clutched her satchel tighter against her body, feeling every threadbare seam of her strangeness. In that moment, she was not a guest. She was not a wife. She was not even a woman with a name. She was a transaction dropped in the center of a circle that did not ask for her. She was the white woman, a concept, not a person. After a brief exchange, James gestured for her to follow. He led her toward the edge of the village, to a modest dwelling made of hides and willow frames. Outside, a woman sat grinding something in a bowl with slow, rhythmic motions. Her hair was long and gray, braided and wrapped in faded ribbon. Her back was hunched but steady. Her hands, though speckled with age, moved with practiced grace. "This is Tunka," James said. "You'll stay with her." Tunka looked up. Her face was lined like the folds of time itself, but her eyes, dark, clear, still met Martha Jane's without hesitation. She said something in Lakota, a stream of soft syllables that flowed like water over stone. Then she stood, motioned toward the doorway, and held aside the flap. James gave a final nod. "She doesn't speak English," he said simply, "but she's kind." Then he was gone. Inside, the dwelling was surprisingly cool. The earth floor was swept smooth. A mat had been laid in one corner, beside a small clay pot of water. Bundles of herbs hung overhead, and the smell bitter, earthy, not unpleasant, wrapped around Martha Jane like an unfamiliar comfort. Tunka moved without hurry, setting down a bowl near the fire, stirring something thick and steaming. She pointed to the mat. Martha Jane, unsure what else to do, sat. The silence was not awkward. It was a kind of peace she hadn't known existed, one where nothing was expected of her except breath and stillness. Tunka placed the bowl into her hands. Corn stew, thick with root vegetables, fragrant with a spice she couldn't name. No words passed between them. And yet, in that moment, Martha Jane felt less alone than she had in weeks, maybe years. That night, she lay beneath a woolen blanket, staring up at the shadow-draped curve of the hide ceiling. Outside, the village murmured soft footsteps, distant laughter, the creak of wooden frames. She was within it, yet apart. No one had spoken to her. No one had said her name. She was surrounded by people, and still completely unknown. But Tunka had handed her food without fear, had given her a space to sleep, had lit a fire, and not turned her back. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection. It was a beginning. And as she closed her eyes, Martha Jane thought not of her parents, nor of James, nor even of the world she'd left by it. She thought only this: maybe I don't need to be understood to belong. Maybe I just need to stay long enough not to be feared. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of sweat, silence, and arm muscles. Martha Jane woke before the sun most mornings, stirring beside the warmth of Tunka's fire. The air still heavy with the bitter scent of crushed herbs and smoke. Her arms ached from the unfamiliar strain of work, carrying water in sloshing clay pots, splitting kindling with a dull hatchet, pounding maize until her palms blistered and bled. Every task felt like a test, every glance a verdict. The women of the village didn't speak to her. But they didn't ignore her either. They watched quiet, reserved, their expressions neither cruel nor kind. One or two offered small gestures, a correction of her grip, a hand swiftly redirecting her motion. But when she dropped a basket of dried roots, scattering them like brittle stars across the ground, no one bent to help her gather them. She did it alone, her face burning. The men were less subtle. A few sneered outright when she passed. One young warrior, broad-shouldered and brash, his hair braided with hawk feathers, spoke a sharp phrase in Lakota when she fumbled with a grinding stone. It made the others laugh. She didn't know the words, but the tone was unmistakable derision, like she was some ungainly beast trying to mimic their grace. Martha Jane turned away, her fingers trembling around the smooth curve of the pestle. Her breath caught, not from exhaustion, but humiliation. She wanted to vanish, to fold inward until only the earth could hold her. But she stayed. And though James Black Elk stood across the fire pit, though he heard the laughter, saw her falter, he didn't step in. He didn't silence the warrior or offer her comfort. He simply watched. His gaze didn't linger, but it didn't look away either. Just long enough to say, "I see you." That night, she found a small knife on the blanket at the door of Tunka's lodge. Its handle was carved from driftwood, darkened by age and soy. On it, faintly etched, was a single line in English: "No one starts strong." No note, no name. But she knew. The message landed deeper than any comfort could. It didn't erase the shame, but it offered her something far more enduring: dignity. Each day after that, she worked harder. She dropped the maize less, learned how to fold the woven baskets the right way, memorized the rhythm of the drum used to signal meal times, how the women adjusted their braids for mourning or for ceremony. She watched the hands of others more than their faces. His hands, she discovered, did not lie. They told stories in calluses and scars, in swift movements and subtle pauses. Still, mistakes found her. A pot she carried cracked from being set too hot on stone. A row of firewood collapsed when she stacked it unevenly. And again, the laughter came. Not cruel, not mocking this time, but surprised. She didn't cry anymore. She just nodded, bit her lip, and started over. And every so often, when she was certain no one else noticed, James did. He never offered praise, never even looked at her for too long. But once, after she successfully hoisted a full bucket of water without spilling it, she returned to find a fresh roll of cloth bandages left outside her tent. No explanation, just quiet understanding. Another cure. When she correctly sorted wild roots Tunka had harvested, a small braided leather cord was tied neatly around her basket handle the next morning. She recognized his knot. These were not grand gestures, not declarations. They were recognitions. She was not invisible. That changed everything. One afternoon, after nearly toppling a rack of draining herbs in front of several elders, she sat behind Tunka's lodge, elbows on her knees, sweat dripping from her brow. Her body ached. But the deeper pain was elsewhere, in the place where worth was measured by failure. She stared at her palms, raw, swollen, still soft in the wrong ways. She heard footsteps crunch in the dirt. James. He didn't speak, didn't sit. He simply crouched near a patch of bitterroot she'd overlooked earlier that day and began to tend it, quietly, slowly, as if nothing needed to be said. Martha Jane watched him. When he rose, he didn't look at her, but before he walked away, he said just loud enough to carry: "Roots grow stronger when they're buried deeper." Then he was gone, and Martha Jane, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to break here. Maybe she was meant to bloom. The morning air was crisp that day, the sky too pale for summer, as the village gathered for a memorial ceremony at the central fire pit. A man had died on the northern ridge, another loss caused by military scouts cutting too close to tribal lands. Tense whispers spread among the Lakota, and even Martha Jane felt a hollow ache as she watched muted rituals take place. In the ripple of grief, she noticed James's usual composed gait falter. He stood by the fire with others, shaven head bowed, shoulders slack as if weighed by memories. His face was still, but within it lay quiet storms. As drums echoed on bone and hide, Jane felt something shift a distance she couldn't cross. Not by invitation, not by courage. The ceremony ended, and the villagers drifted back to routines, leaving behind embers and silence. Jane watched from a distance as James moved away from the group. Something pulled her to follow an instinct, a concern. She found him leaning against a fallen log near the creek, far from the village. In his hands, he held a small piece of wood, weathered, waterlogged, with faded carvings. She stood still, watching his fingers trace the markings. There were names: a woman's name, a child's name, a small set of letters worn but legible. She could sense the sorrow radiating from those carved initials. James ran a finger along the wood, eyes distant. Jane swallowed. The man she thought, unflinching in the face of hardship, was trembling with a grief she had never seen. "Charlie, little eagle," he whispered, though she was there to hear. She stood a moment longer, afraid to interrupt. The silence spoke louder than any words. At last, James placed the wood gently on the ground and walked away, without a glance, leaving Jane with a new kind of ache. That evening, she found herself pulling weeds beside Tunka's lodge. Wian, Tunka's granddaughter, was there spooning wolfberries into a leather pouch with soft concentration. She looked up when Jane approached. "Grandmother said the memorial today was for her cousin," Wian said quietly, eyes gentle as dusk. "A child, just 6 summers old." She paused, letting Jane absorb the sadness. "Cousin?" Jane asked softly, her own voice strange to her ears. "Yes, Chief's boy. Taken too early." Wian fiddled with the pouch's drawstring. "Grandmother says James lost his family, his wife and daughter, when soldiers swept through their camp years ago." Jane's breath caught. The silent man she saw every day, the one whose calm had always unnerved her. It was not stoicism. It was mourning for lives he once held close, now gone forever. Tunka joined them, leaning on Wian's shoulder, though unable to speak English. Her eyes conveyed understanding. She reached out, pressed a wrinkled hand to Jane's shoulder, and offered compassion for grief without words. That night, Jane sat alone in her small room, the smell of sage and cedar heavy in the air. She thought of that carved wood outside the creek, the names etched by hands that still trembled. She thought of James's slowed gait, the way the fire ceremony had hollowed him. She felt suddenly protective, yet helpless. How could she speak to him about names that meant so much and so little? She drifted to sleep with the thought, those who bear the deepest scar do so in silence. And perhaps her own story wasn't so different. The next morning, she rose early and made her way to the small clearing by the creek. The carved wood was gone, but the log remained. She picked up a small chip of bark and carved her initials in tiny letters. Under the mark of a wheat stalk, her own silent acknowledgement that she, too, carried names buried and forgotten. When James appeared mid-morning, she was still kneeling, her breath soft. He stopped short, watching. "Mine is just survivor's mark," she said without looking at him. He stood silent. Then, very slowly, he sat beside her, No words, just presence. They stayed like that until the sun climbed higher, two souls sharing broken legacies without speech, each understanding the scars under the silence. A few days after the memorial, the trader from the frontier post returned this time, bringing rumors that slipped through the village like wind through canvas. Heard that girl, the Odell one, used to carry a preacher's child. Now she's living with a redskin warrior, knows how to survive. That one. A group of children overheard the words, then passed them along like a game whispered through cupped hands. Soon, women in the village began murmuring behind bent heads, casting sidelong glances at Jane as she walked by. The elders said nothing aloud, but they didn't have to. Their eyes carried enough doubt, enough quick judgment. That afternoon, James returned from a short hunting trip. As he led his horse across the hard-packed earth, he caught a strange look from a group of villagers near the well. One young warrior smirked, muttered something in Lakota. Jane's name was in it. James stopped in his tracks. "What was that?" he asked, voice cold and low. Another man replied, half laughing, half serious. "Maybe your newest prize has always known how to charm men. She just found a new kind." James didn't ask more. His jaw tightened, his gaze sharpened. Then he turned, leaving the horse untethered as he strode toward the trees. By then, Jane had skipped her meal and slipped quietly from the village as the sun dipped behind the tree line. She didn't know where she meant to go, only that she couldn't bear another minute beneath those stairs. Her feet carried her to the old creek, the one where she had once sat beside James, first seeing the names he carved into wood. A place of silence, a place where, for a fleeting moment, something gentle had existed. She sat by the water's edge, her hands trembling as she brushed at ripples. In her mind rang laughter, the mocking gaze of that white man, the way her past had been dragged out like a stain that would never wash clean. She thought she had moved on. She hadn't. The wound had only ever scabbed. James found her there. He stood among the trees for a long while, watching her shoulders shiver. Then he stepped forward, quiet, unhurried. He didn't speak, didn't call her name. He simply sat beside her, close enough for her to know she wasn't alone, far enough not to intrude. Jane knew it was him, but she didn't turn away. Her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. I heard them. They said, "I had a child with a preacher, that I used it to get what I have now." James said nothing at first. His breath was slow, measured. Then gently, "Rumors are like dull knives. They don't kill quickly, but they bleed you every day." Jane looked down at the water. "I don't know what to do." James reached into his coat and pulled out that familiar piece of wood. He set it on a fallen log between them. "They talked about me, too," he said I was a coward for surviving, that I should have died with my wife and daughter. Jane turned toward him. He spoke like telling a story that didn't belong to him. But his eyes held the ache of a man who had bled too long in silence. "I keep this etched with their names, so I remember I still have something to live for. Not because they forgot, but because I refuse to." Jane's throat tightened. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry that kind of pain." James didn't hesitate. "You've already carried more than most. You just don't see it yet." The creek kept whispering. They didn't speak again. But in that hush, Jane felt the first crack in the darkness lift. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the trader's cruel words had drifted through the village, leaving Martha Jane's heart raw and uncertain. Now, as illness fanned its grip across the settlement, first striking elders, then babes too weak to resist, Jane's purpose ignited when Tunka called for help. Jane felt both fear and determination welling within her. She remembered the doubt-laced gaze she had endured, the whispers that once followed her footsteps. But she carried with her something more profound this morning, a sense of duty rooted in survival and art. Entering Tunka's lodge, the air heavy with the scent of boiling yarrow and elderberries, Jane knelt beside a feverish toddler, whose eyes had once skirted away at her. Now, the boy clung to her gown as she applied cool towels and whispered gentle words. With hands that had once trembled at simple chores, Jane now grounded poultices of herbs, measured bowls of broth, and tended to the sick with a steady compassion that surprised even herself. She washed water into a parched mouth, pressed ointments into aching joints, and in each act of care, she felt her own wounds begin to mend. Soon, the village began to murmur, "She's helping. She knows what to do." Women who had avoided her now met her gaze with a soft nod, their eyes acknowledging a quiet competence they had once doubted. Children who had flinched at her presence now greeted her, daring even to smile. In a moment of respite, Tunka's apprentice healer approached. His gaze carried respect rather than pity. "Jane, you did well," he said simply. For the first time in her life, she felt pride well up, not fear. She thanked him, her voice shy but firm. He replied gently, "It takes courage to face illness with a healer's heart." That evening, just as dusk draped the lodge in shadow and light, James returned from patrol. He paused at the doorway, watching with quiet pride as Jane knelt by an elderly woman, spooning broth and cooling her fevered brow. Their eyes met, wordlessly. He stepped forward to stand beside her, not intruding, but offering steady presence. The woman, once frail and frightened, sipped the broth and murmured appreciation. James closed his eyes in relief. As Jane rose slowly, he leaned closer and spoke softly. "You didn't need to be small to be great." Her furrowed brow lifted. He added, "You are a fire worth keeping." Later, Jane found herself by the creek, gently rinsing used herbs in a bowl of warm water under a moonlit canopy of cottonwoods. The night swirled in shimmering reflections of her journey, fear, shame, healing, and renewal. James came silently to stand beside her, draping a woolen wrap around her shoulders. She admitted the truth. "I was afraid to be small again." He matched her whisper, "Yet tonight, you saved lives." They shared no grand declarations, just a deep stillness that carried more than any words could. The next day, the illness returned with a vengeance, striking Mato's younger sister. Panic rippled through families. Jane hurried as they carried the child into Tunka's lodge. Panic was in everyone's eyes. Jane's hands, once timid, now moved with quiet conviction. Cold compresses, nourishing broth, soothing ministrations. James remained at her side, unwavering. When her strength waned, she felt his silent anchor behind her. That night, the child's fever broke at last. Mothers wept with relief. Elders nodded in approval, and the lodge filled with grateful warmth. Jane, exhausted beyond sickness or shame, felt something new within her, the bright ember of her own worth. As she was about to sway, James reached out but did not speak. He guided her gently to a waiting seat and stood by her, letting the moment speak. When a few women gently gathered around to express thanks, and Weekon rushed to embrace her, Jane looked to James. His eyes met hers, luminous, unwavering. Then, softly but clearly, he addressed her, not the villagers, as if his words mattered most. "You were never small, and now they all see who you truly are." A hushed approval rose from the group. Some nodded, others looked away in shame. He continued, turning his gaze wide. "Your heart was larger than their fear. That is why you are a fire we must keep." That night, Jane slipped out beneath the crescent moon, carrying a small bundle dried lavender, mint, and sage gifts of healing she laid at the edge of the fire pit. She did not expect James at her side, but there he was, offering his silent support. He reached for her hand, gentle and unassuming. In that quiet darkness, surrounded by embers and moonlight, they stood side by side, not as a girl once judged, nor as a stoic warrior, but as two souls shaped by grief, kindness, and hope. In that moment, Martha Jane understood she was no longer merely that girl. She had become a healer, a survivor, a source of light. The fire was hers to keep, and James, in standing beside her, ensured it would never be left to extinguish. It was a crisp autumn morning when the distant sound of hooves shattered the quiet ritual of dawn. Smoke curled above the cooking fires, and birds paused mid-flight as a small procession appeared along the ridge, 3 riders cloaked in dust and purpose, cutting through the first golden rays of a new day. One was familiar, Rebecca Odell, her face pale with what she called grief. Beside her rode a stiff-backed man in clerical black, and behind them, 2 soldiers in blue coats. Jane stood by the larder, distributing cornmeal into buckets for the sick. When the band reached the edge of camp, time folded inward. She recognized the shape of her mother's bonnet before she saw the face. A coldness clamped around Jane's heart, squeezing tight. The soldiers dismounted, boots thudding on earth that had become home. Tonka and the elders followed slowly, curiosity and care painted across their features. Rebecca's eyes glistened as she approached. Vox shaken, she patted Jane's cheek with feigned tenderness. "My darling daughter," she whispered, "you must come home. You must restore our family's honor." A tremor ran through Jane's hands as she set down the bucket. "Honor?" she asked, voice brittle. "Honor? You talk of honor when you left me to rot while the world watched my shame." Behind her, James stepped forward, silent and taut like a bowstring. He placed himself between Jane and her mother, his eyes keenly calm, the steady anchor she'd come to rely on. Rebecca shifted, as though rediscovering her daughter's presence. "Julia," she said, using the name she had almost buried. "We brought a man of God." That was when the young minister cleared his throat, standing tall, chest reinforced by faith. "Daughter," he intoned, "God invites you to repentance. Come home, forsake this sin, and be the Christian woman we raised." Jane felt her breath hitch, like iron gates slamming shut around her ribs. She saw how the Lakota stepped back, their warm presence thinning. The soldiers watched, hands near rifles, stiff with expectation. A hush fell, as though the air itself paused to watch. James's jaw clenched. She could almost feel his pulse in the space behind her. She closed her eyes, tasting the acrid sting of old shame. All her carefully built life here, caregiving, trust, small daily moments of acceptance quaked under their gaze. Rebecca's expression softened, but it carried no warmth. "Our name suffers. You, living here beside a Lakota, this is scandal. I beg you, Julia, save us from ruin." Jane's throat burned. "I saved lives here," she said, voice steady but trembling. She glanced at the healer's lodge, at the child she'd rescued. "Why do you only care when it's your reputation, and never about what I needed?" The minister's gaze narrowed. "Because souls matter more than sentiment. You've traded the church for primitive superstition." The Lakota elders gasped softly. Attention struck like thunder. James's eyes flashed, and for a single heartbeat, Jane braced for conflict. But he didn't raise a hand. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "She belongs here," he said, not just to Rebecca, but to the Donski laboring over their confrontation. Not to salvage family pride, nor to be forced into a life she never chose. Rebecca recoiled, eyes flickering between mother and warrior. "They will take this as defiance," she warned. Nodding at the soldiers, a soldier spat slightly, the sound cutting the quiet. "Ma'am, you're welcome to return without her. Or you can come both." Jane looked at James, then her anchor. His body said calm. His eyes said faith. She surprised herself with a slow, steady inhale, feeling the power in choosing. She shook her head. No. Her own voice surprised her. "I will not go." Rebecca's face paled further. The minister's lips twisted with disapproval. The two soldiers straightened, rifles heavy at their sides. From the edge of the circle, Tunka's voice, quiet but firm, spoke Lakota. James translated, "She stays. This is her place." Rebecca's shoulders slumped, and she turned away, her procession collapsing into something small, defeated. James stood beside Jane. He lifted her hand, brushing her fingers with his thumb. His voice was soft, meant only for her. They feared what they did not understand. "Don't fear that." Jane closed her eyes, leaning back into the support he offered. She felt her spine straighten. Another dawn had come, not of forgiveness or family, not yet, but of belonging and choice. That crisp autumn morning, as golden light filtered through the lodge's shutters, tension lay heavy in the air. Jane's parents, Rebecca Odell, with tears that mirrored guilt, the solemn young minister, and two blue-uniformed soldiers stood before Tunka's lodge. Beside them stood a well-dressed merchant, posture poised and gaze calculating. They weren't there to persuade with love. They offered a carefully wrapped deal. "You could come home," Rebecca said, voice sweet and edged. "A prosperous merchant knows your past, and he's willing to forgive it. He will marry you. You can live in comfort, surrounded by wealth, and leave all that shame behind." In that moment, the familiar world, creekside evenings and evenings warmed by James's quiet presence, seemed to crumble. The proposition hung in the crisp air: return to luxury or remain in this rugged life, built on your own terms. Jane's fingers went cold as she met her mother's gaze, an expression of wounded pride and desperate need for reputation's redemption. Rebecca leaned forward, voice thick. "This opportunity will never come again. For someone like you, it's everything." Jane's heart pounded. She turned to James, standing unwavering behind her. He offered nothing but presence, no urging, no resistance yet. Everything was there in his steadiness. He didn't demand she stay, but he anchored her in place. Then James spoke, voice calm but firm. "If you choose to leave, I will walk you to the edge of the trail. No one should hold someone who no longer belongs." The forest seemed to still. The birds hushed. In that charged silence, Jane felt the pull of old shadows, her childhood, forced compliance, the weight of being treated as an object. But she also felt the embers she'd built here, the lives she'd touched, the healing she'd offered, the trust she'd earned. And the man who stood beside her, not as a captor, but as an equal believer. She caught her reflection in the water pool at James's feet. She saw herself no longer frightened or second-hand. She looked back toward the merchant, the minister's symbols of comfortable surrender, and knew that path wasn't hers. Their touch would come with strings, her dignity, her identity, bound in exchange. She turned back to James. In his gaze she found reassurance, not pity, not pressure, just solidarity. The tiniest upward tug of his lips was all she needed. Together, breathing deep, she stepped forward. The world seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, she looked at Rebecca, not as a daughter returning, but as a woman risen from ashes. "Thank you for the offer," she said softly, voice steady and clear. "But I won't return. Your family's honor no longer binds me. I have my own honor, who I am, what I stand for, not dictated by any name." The merchant stiffened. The minister's face hardened. One of the soldiers bristled to speak, but Jane lifted a hand to forestall him. I have taken responsibility already, and now I choose accountability here, where I already am, where I help, where I'm free. James stepped forward, touching her arm softly, no fanfare, but a gesture of unity. The merchant's eyes flickered, recognition dawning. She isn't a commodity to be bought. Rebecca stood silent, stripped of her arguments. The soldiers exchanged uneasy looks. The air seemed to quiver around them. Jane turned to James, then spoke, voice resonant. I will stay here, with him, with this community. I am imperfect sometimes, but this is me, and this is where I belong. James inclined his head, taking her hand and squeezing it, holding her world within his grasp. A breeze rolled across the drying leaves outside, smelling of earth, smoke, and untamed freedom. It whispered of change, but nothing could extinguish the fire glowing in Jane's heart now. A crimson dawn swept across the prairie, the air biting with cold and carrying the scent of dust and upheaval. As the settlement stirred to life, Martha Jane stood at the center of the lodge's courtyard, the wind tugging at her hair and her newly forged resolve. She looked to James, who rested a steady hand on her shoulder, a silent confirmation of what she already knew. She was not fragile. She was found. I don't need sobbing, she murmured, voice strong even as her heart thundered. I am already alive. In that moment, she became both witness and force for what was to come. Life had flowed quietly in these weeks, tending crops at sunrise, gathering herbs under the moonlight, healing the wounded, but peace, as she had learned, could shatter as fragile as thin ice. Mid-morning light. Then a piercing cry, raiders coming. Little Dear's voice carried panic and disbelief. In a heartbeat, Jane shed any lingering hesitation. She rallied the women, organizing water, bandages, blankets, encouraging the frightened, mindfully directing each to safety. There was no victim in her. She was a shield and a center of gravity. Chaos erupted as a band of outlaws descended on them, guns firing, dust swirling in the red wind. The Lakota warriors jumped into defense amid the storm. James was struck, collapsing to the ground, his arm bloodied. Jane froze only for a heartbeat, then leapt into action, tearing cloth, binding wounds, shouting for water, refusing to let death dictate their fate. She knelt beside him, pressing the cloth to his skin, whispering breathless prayers over muffled breaths. The red wind whipped her hair and carried the copper smell of blood. But she did not falter. Her tears mingled with dust. When she looked into his eyes, she saw gratitude and wonder. He spoke her name with a hushed reverence. In that moment, she understood she was not just lifesaver, she was redeemer. The battle waned. The raiders retreated under the disciplined force of warriors. But Jane's work had only begun. She moved among the wounded and the women, guiding everyone with efficient compassion, washing bloodied faces, administering broth, bandaging open wounds, and administering herbal salves she had learned from Tonka. Little Dear stood in awe as she tended James again, carefully cleaning his wound and softly talking him through pain and fever. He would have died without you, Mato said low, respect in his eyes. But he lives, and so do we. Night fell, and fires were lit around the perimeter. Jane remained at the center of the healing circle, as the captured outlaws were bound and questioned. Under gentle lamplight, she washed the blood from James's cheek. He looked at her, voice cracked. You were born for this. Tears of gratitude replaced the sweat and soot on her face. Not born but chosen. I choose to stand with you all around them. The camp seemed to exhale as one. When dawn's pale light broke the next morning, the raiders were escorted away beneath watchful eyes. The wounds, physical and spiritual, were bound. James, still weakened but alive, stepped with Jane to the creek's edge. The dust had settled, and the water ran clear once more. Children laughed by its banks. Elders shared stories with gentle amusement. Jane stood tall among them, her earth-toned dress brushed by soft morning light. Women approached, touching her arm with pawnee. Tunka placed a wrinkled hand on her shoulder. James whispered in her ear, "You saved us all." She replied, voice firm yet tender, "We saved each other." Overhead, the sky shone without cloud, and the prairie began to awaken to a new day. But at the edge of camp, near the fading embers of the night's fire, Martha Jane and James paused. She cupped clear creek water in her hands, letting it slip through her fingers like the closing of a chapter. He slid his hand around hers. "Today I realized something," she said softly, eyes lighting with unshakable certainty. "I don't just live, I protect." James gazed at her with wonder, the rising sun painting their silhouettes in gold. "Then you belong with us," he said, voice steady. "And we belong with you." Together, they returned to the circle of life they had helped repair. The red wind had blown through them, test of fire, respect, and unity, and left in its wake something stronger, bolder, unbreakably human. Martha Jane was no longer that frightened girl caught between worlds. She was a healer, a protector, a flame that refused to be extinguished even by the fiercest gales. A chill autumn wind continued to sweep across the prairie as the final embers of the celebration faded into the twilight. In that sacred stillness, Tunka, her aged face imbued with solemn dignity, softly placed a bundle of sweetgrass and a small feather into Martha Jane's hands. The Lakota elders began to chant her new name in their native tongue, Wilaya, the woman who carries the warm light. In that moment, it was as if a veil had been lifted. Her new name was more than a title. It was the deepest recognition of her journey, a testament to the warmth she had brought to the desperate, the fierce protection she offered in moments of fear, and the quiet hope she had become for a community reborn. A single feather was pinned delicately into her braid. Brushing against her cheek like a promise, tears silently streamed down Martha Jane's face, not of shame, but of profound belonging. She had found where she was meant to stand. Later that evening, beneath a pale moonlight that glimmered on the creek where their memories had taken root, James approached her in silence. He gently brushed a stray braid from her face, a gesture tender and reverent. In his eyes glowed warmth and quiet pride, deep as the embers from last night's fire. "Jane," he whispered, voice low and heartfelt. "That name suits you, but it's more than a name. You're not just the one who carries the light. You are the light itself." She turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest, tears reflecting the moonlight's fragile glow. James took a slow breath, gathering courage. "I love you, Jane," he said softly but with unshakable clarity. "Not for your work, not for the name the tribe gave you, but because you chose all of this this life. Above all, your self. I could never expect you to stay out of duty or obligation." A gentle breeze stirred the water's surface, carrying away yesterday's burdens and bringing forward tomorrow's possibilities. Martha Jane closed her eyes, feeling that same breeze swirl around her braid, stirring her freedom and newfound strength to the roots of her soul. She looked at him, her tears glistening with anything but doubt. "James, I choose to stay. Not because I owe anything to anyone, not because I needed a name, but because I love you," she replied, her voice tender, strong, and full of purpose. Their foreheads touched, and James's hand found her cheek, conveying more than any spoken vow. Their silent embrace spoke volumes. A few days later, under a frost-kissed dawn, James led Jane toward the ridge that overlooked the valley they had helped heal. Tall grasses swayed in the lingering chill, and the rising sun painted the horizon with warmth. As they climbed higher, the valley unfolded below them in living color: cabins with curling smoke, fields heavy with grain, children laughing by the creek, and women gathering at the hearths. It was a landscape of renewal, each detail filled with meaning they had created together. At the summit, James drew her close, his arms enveloping her like home. No words were needed. The embrace itself was an expression of everything they had become. The wind, still tinged with that dusty red of past storms, swept across her hair and toyed with the tails of his coat, filling the moment with wild promise. He reached into his pocket and offered her a small wooden charm, a simple sun, carved with feathered rays. In his palm, it was more than a token. It was a silent vow, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been forged anew. Jane pressed the charm against her heart, her eyes glistening. She took a deep breath, looked out across the valley, and spoke softly, her voice barely louder than the rustling grasses but carrying the weight of all they had endured. What they saw as shame became her wind. What they threw away became our fire. In that instant, under the vast sky, two figures stood side by side, no longer defined by past burdens or the judgments of others, but anchored by love, choice, and transformation. Their journey, once marked by shame and survival, found its truest expression here, in sanctity. And as the wind caressed her hair and carried their words across the prairie, they stepped forward together, unbound by anyone, rooted in truth, ready for whatever the story would become next.